Alright, it's time for a new build video from me. This one's for all the responsible gun owners out there. We're making use of the dual Guardian pistols. Now that ArenaNet has given us guns, they can't take them away. I know my rights. But all jokes aside, Guardian pistols are super fun. They're the weapon I never knew I needed. The pistols fit perfectly into the Willbender spec. They're Condi damage based and they hit fast and often, just what we need for Willbender. This build is actually sort of just going to be an updated version of my previous Willbender build. I'll admit, not a lot has changed, and I think that's partly because the pistols seem to be designed with Condi damage builds in mind. So any Condi damage Willbender build will benefit greatly from the pistols. I'm still going to go over the entire build for those who are interested and want to see the whole thing, and then after we can discuss things a little bit further. Okay, first is gear. Full Celestial on weapons and armor and accessories. Celestial stats work very well on Willbender, since you have the ability to self-sustain, deal damage, and generate boons all at the same time. Having all stats covered will help you survive while solo a lot easier. Most of our damage comes from Condi damage, so we will use Rune of the Trapper to boost Condi damage and duration. For weapons, the standard setup I go with now is dual pistols, of course, and Sword Torch. Sigils are very easy. We use Sigil of Earth on the main hand and Bursting on the offhand. Relic is Relic of the Fractal. With the new addition of pistols, we will now be applying Bleeding, so we can make use of this relic for extra damage. Moving over to traits, I haven't actually changed any of the traits from my previous build. With Willbender, we go with top, middle, top. Searing Pact for more Condi damage, Holy Reckoning for might and fury generation, and Phoenix Protocol so Virtue of Resolve gives alacrity when triggered. Virtues, Willbender triggers virtues constantly, so the virtues trait line helps a lot. We go with bottom, middle, top. Master of Consecration, since we'll be using Purging Flames, Absolute Resolve so we can have a Condi cleanse on Virtue of Resolve, and Permeating Wrath for the Virtue of Justice enhancement. And finally Radiance, we take top, middle, top. Inner Fire, we will proc this very often, so this, paired with our other fury sources, will pretty much have permanent fury. Radiant Fire, again, this will trigger constantly, giving you some bonus DPS. And Amplified Wrath for the obvious burning enhancements. As for the skill bar, I go with Litany of Wrath for the heal, since you can pretty much full heal yourself with it if you time it well and keep dealing damage while it's active. Utilities, there are a lot of debate and discussion that can be had about these. My typical setup is Whirling Light, Purging Flames, and Stand Your Ground. The elite skill, I personally go with Heaven's Palm for the CC damage it has. I think you'll just get a lot of value out of this skill for that reason, and that is the base setup for the build. Okay, earlier I mentioned there are some options here, which we can discuss now. Let's start with the utility skills. Purging Flames is a must. Lots of damage from the burning stacks. You need to just try your best to use it when enemies stop moving. And it can also cleanse Condi, which is nice, but for the record, don't use Purging Flames with that intention. You should be using this only with offense in mind. Stand Your Ground is important mainly for the stun break. When playing solo, you need to have a stun break, just in case. You could also go with Save Yourselves as your stun break and get a big boost of boons while you're at it, but this will also pull Condis from allies to yourself, so you have to be careful using this if other players are nearby. Whirling Light. In the previous video, many people had a problem with me running this, so I will repeat what I said there. This is more of a flex slot. You can swap this out for anything you might feel you need. For example, Sword of Justice, Bow of Truth, Signet of Wrath, whatever you think you want. I like Whirling Light since it has a pretty low cooldown, even lower if we keep alacrity, and it hits really fast, which we need for Willbender. As for the elite skill, I take Heaven's Palm for the hard CC. Without this, you might find yourself struggling to deal with break bars when solo. Pistol 5 has a hard CC, but it's not reliable enough to serve as your only CC. Most people go with Feel My Wrath for the quickness, which is also a good choice. So if that's what you like, fair and valid. But I feel as though Heaven's Palm will provide more value. I suppose you could just swap between the two depending on what you need in the current situation. Okay, on to the gear. Let's talk about the big changes here. The Relic. Relic of the Fractal will get triggered quite often. Pistols apply bleeding, and a lot of it. And paired with Sigil of Earth, you will apply even more bleeding. This relic does actually help squeeze out a bit more DPS. If you don't really care about that and you want more of a defensive choice, I could recommend Relic of the Defender. That way, any of your blocks will heal you as well. For weapons, we're sticking with pistols, obviously. I often find myself sometimes using only pistols, never even swapping weapons at all. But of course, we do need another weapon set. Sword Torch is the classic. relic, since sword hits fast and often, it will consistently trigger our virtues, and torch will give us those big burning stacks. But some people have mentioned that they think sword torch is boring, and that's true. It is. So you can do two things. Switch to dual swords, they will still hit fast and add a bit more mobility, or you can go with greatsword, which is probably the most fun guardian weapon. Greatsword also checks all the boxes we need, hits fast and often, and as a bonus, skill 5 brings a bit more CC. It's really up to you what you want to run. I occasionally switch between all of these just for some variety. I've done a bit of DPS testing, and the differences in DPS between these weapons is honestly negligible. Out in the open world in combat, you're really not going to notice any differences. Really quickly, I would like to touch on my stat, rune, and sigil choices. When it comes to stats, I feel that generally speaking, most players will be best off going with full celestial, mostly since it's really easy. I'm aware that there are ways of min-maxing with Viper or Grieving gear to get a bit better stat spread, but while testing those things, I found the difference in DPS to really not be that much. And the more celestial you swap out, the less effective your defenses become, so you have to keep that in mind too. When it comes to the rune, some players will argue that Rune of Balthazar is better since it lets you get to 100% burning increase. But since this build also applies a lot of bleeding, I think Trapper is better since it offers a boost to Condi in general, so it provides a bit more value. Once again, I did test both and I felt as though the Trapper rune gave me a little bit more consistent DPS. Honestly, I find this build is more dependent on your actual performance and not so much about how you try to min-max it. Now you may have noticed that both of our sigils are just for adding more DPS. Earth will let us apply more bleeding to trigger Relic of the Fractal, and bursting is just a flat Condi damage bonus. You could switch up the sigils to get some kind of utility, but this build already has so much utility available, I prefer to just go with these two for some more DPS. Okay, and some general gameplay tips here if by chance you're unfamiliar with Willbender. All you really have to do is activate your virtues and then hit your target as much as possible while they're active to trigger the effects. And that's pretty much it. Once the virtues are active, they trigger after a few hits each, which is why we take weapons and skills that hit fast and many times. The more hits you land, the more you will trigger the effects. And you can have multiple virtue effects active at the same time, and you can trigger them multiple times in one use. So feel free to fire away your virtues as much as you want. Alright, so just like in my last Willbender build, I'd like to end the video with a few disclaimer comments. Being a solo-focused build, what content you're able to solo is more dependent on you. This build will give you everything you need, but you still need to be the one to learn it and play it properly. I've been able to solo bounties, hero point challenges, champions, rifts, all with not too much trouble. You may notice from this gameplay that I am by no means a flawless player. I very often make mistakes with gameplay and rotations, but even still, this build continues to perform as intended. Which is another strength of this build, it allows for mistakes and less than perfect gameplay without compromising too much effectiveness, which isn't always the case with, well, a lot of builds. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this or you found it interesting, and maybe this build will help you out. But until next time, bye for now.